So our second panelist is Peter Rusch. His PhD is in chemistry, and his interest has been in computers and chemical information, and that led to his joining the Chemical Abstract Services Research Department at the American Chemical Society. In that position, he helped customers understand the increasing offerings of chemical information that were then distributed on magnetic tape media. That work evolved in his being the technical liaison to the developing online services. After joining Dialog in 1975, he developed its chemical and patent information services. Peter.
Okay, thanks, Brian. I think I saw this guy at lunch sometime earlier this week.
Yeah, he was a pretty handsome young guy, huh?
He still has the badge, I might add. Yeah, just to kind of take you back in time into the 70s when I joined Dialog. It was, as Rogers mentioned, the time of mainframe computers. And one of the things that constrained us for a while was memory and storage, and they were very low density and rather expensive. Now, computers happily were going through their own evolution at the time, and we eventually became a system where we had 4 mainframe computers serving customers and all the attendant software and telecommunications and the rest. But back in the beginning, telecommunications were dial-up with an acoustic coupler. For a while, I'm pretty sure we actually served some customers over the teletype network, primarily from Asia because they knew how to use teletypes. That eventually disappeared. And of course, the new packet switch networks made life a lot easier. We eventually developed our own packet switch network, which was DialNet. You can see there the progression of the speeds, and based on our pricing algorithm, it was not particularly good news, but it was easy to see when 9600 baud became available because the big customers immediately gravitated toward that and wanted to have that kind of speed available. I might also mention that, let's just go on to the next point, which is we've already heard about assembly language software was the primary use. Multi-user environment was very challenging and had lots of peripheral computer work done to support it. The database items, which we can come back to in a minute, were basically in separate files. So the customer had to make a choice in the beginning as to exactly what he thought was the best choice for answering the questions that he had. Each item in the database had an accession number, which we'll return to in a minute as well. As Roger mentioned, we had a retrieval system based on an inverted file search. That offered tremendous opportunities. I might also mention that we had a companion file, also indexed by accession number, which was the display file, which was in fact what we would then send to the customer, since we didn't want to send them the entire inverted file. And that was, of course, compressed with an idiosyncratic compression method because of that low density storage that was expensive. And finally, I should mention about the user interface. It was text only. Now that was typical of the day, but it was only text. There were no PCs. There were no graphical user interfaces. It was all text oriented, and that had its challenges, but it had also great opportunities. So if we go to the next slide, let's cover some more of the capabilities. Roger has also previously mentioned the command-driven interface, and that was pretty typical for the day. Was command-driven interface. We had a command and then some operations with it. This is the way one of the folks that I knew well would describe it to customers, particularly beginning customers, and it was the system that she called BEST for begin. The customer was required to select a database. The expand operation gave a view to the customer of the inverted index terms. And I might add that one of the big problems there was a lot of misspellings. Things came along that were almost unrecognizable, but they were still in the index. And that index indicated how many items in the database contained that term. You could always see the misspellings because they were only in one item. Then the select command would permit the customer to select their terms of interest, And finally, the type command was an online display feature from that compressed file. Now, one of the innovations, I think, was the creation of sets. And this has been perhaps a little hard to understand, but when the customer made a select of terms of interest, we set aside for that customer a set of accession numbers that responded to that selection. And those sets were numbered, and they were, interestingly, because they were accession numbers, they were conformable for lots of other operations and for recursive use. So we could use those sets in subsequent searches. And the typical sort of search logics that were important naturally were Boolean logic. We spent some time teaching customers about an inclusive OR, which seems a little funny now, but anyway, ands and nots. And these Boolean operators could be used on terms from that expanded inverted index, on sets that had already been created, or on combinations of them. So that gave a tremendous amount of flexibility for this interactive search. We also introduced truncation. This is the famous right-hand truncation, indicated by a question mark. And this was useful to catch a lot of words that had various forms, such as, so I've shown here search question mark, which could be the singular, the plural, could be searching, could be searched, it could be a lot of misspellings. And this was extremely useful and helpful. Now, a lot of people thought we ought to have other forms of truncation. They were a little harder to implement, but this was widely used and quite helpful. And finally, on this slide, I've shown an example of what we called proximity search. And this was a search using the select command where terms would be required in some proximity. So I have put down here an example of fake news, which is different from news next to fake. So this was one of the non-commuting operators that we had. In other words, the position of the requested terms was not interchangeable. You got two separate results. In fact, I hope in this case you get 0 results for the second choice. There were a lot of other operators, some of which were commuting, some of which weren't, and so there was a whole selection of them, but this was by far the most popular. And you could combine truncated terms with other terms using these operators. So there's tremendous flexibility in a search statement. So let's go on to the next slide. Let's see here. And in this one, I want to talk a little bit about licensing. Now, we actually paid for this stuff. And it was kind of important that we do so. Now, our database producers were both foreign and domestic. They came in pretty much 3 large groups. Government organizations. In those days, governments had lots of data, didn't know what to do with it, and both U.S. and foreign governments. There were a lot of not-for-profits that were producing databases, primarily in science and technology. And then, of course, there were the commercial publishers, the people who were actually producing databases for profit. So we licensed from all of them, and it was important that you know that the way databases were created, they were basically curated sets of information. In other words, they had authors or editors who decided what went in and why it should go in there, and it was their selection that we then licensed and made available for search. All of these licenses were under copyright because all the stuff we licensed, actually some of the government stuff was under copyright. There are a lot of interesting problems with that, but some of it was copyright for a while. So I have indicated here 3 types of licenses into which we entered. So first question is, were these exclusive or not? Well, we tended to be non-exclusive, and I personally favored that because I wanted to compete on service and on capabilities rather than on exclusivity. An exclusive user group can get to be extraordinarily demanding, and so we preferred to be non-exclusive, and it was really good for business. We had a second, well, let me go back to the normal license. In a normal license, what we did was we negotiated a fee that we would pay, a royalty, to the owner of the copyright, and then we would have the pricing power to price it as we wished for the customer. And our margin was one that we set. Second opportunity, which was really quite useful in many cases, was the so-called sponsored file. In this case, it was done in reverse. The owner of the database would pay us to make it available, and they would set the price. So we had to be careful about our costs to know that we could in fact cover them, and the profit and the other things we needed to cover. But they actually set the price, and in many cases selected the customers. This seems rather restrictive, but if it's non-exclusive, it turns out that it can be a very interesting way for both parties to participate in online retrieval. And thirdly, I wanted to put in other. You got to have an other in most cases. And the other that was of interest here was that we would get offers for databases that we wanted, and they didn't want to be exclusive because that was difficult for them, particularly government organizations. They didn't really want to be exclusive. But one of the things they could do was to set a minimum payment, and as a result, cut down the number of licenses that they had. We had one database that we licensed for $500,000 a year as a minimum payment, non-exclusive, and we made quite a good market on that one as well. Some of the difficulties we encountered are kind of fun to look through. First, we always wanted to have some royalty-free usage. And after going through all this business about royalties, the owners of the databases weren't too happy with royalty-free usage. But they finally came to understand that it was important for us to market their databases. So we wanted to show them in exhibits where we had customers and potential customers coming through. We also had a huge training program where we trained people on how to use the system using all of those commands that I showed. So eventually, these folks came around and did permit royalty-free use under certain circumstances. Significant point, simply because we needed to expand the business and get more customers. So royalties were among our largest expense. We also had a couple of our large expenses, including leased equipment and salaries, but royalties were clearly among our largest expense, and there was no way to get data in those days other than to license it from those who had created it. Because there were so many different possible producers, we had to deal with a variety of submissions in terms of the formats in which the data arrived at our shop. It almost always came in a magnetic tape. And there are more ways to write a magnetic tape than there are people in this room. So our first challenge was always to figure out how was it organized on that magnetic tape and how we could convert it to our standard format from which all of our processing took place. This consumed a lot of time, took a lot of talent from a lot of people. And the last thing I want to point out, because this was so much fun in talking to database producers, was the dreaded indemnity clause. So I was sitting in a room in Tokyo with representatives from both of our distributors in the Japanese patent office, and we came to this in the contract, and you should have seen the look on their faces. They were all horrified, absolutely horrified. So I proceeded through a translator to try and explain to them that they may have problems with the database. All producers have problems. They might have data that was infringing somebody else's copyright. They might have errors in the database that were created by others or by themselves. But we, offering their database for online searching to customers, would be the first to find out that these things existed in the database and they're not our problem. So So what we asked for was, we asked for them to indemnify us against that, and which, in exchange for which, they got the right to change anything they needed to change to remove the offending material. Well, there was great relief in the room because they knew they had no errors or no problems. That's it, thank you.